This presentation is part of the academic webinar series of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. To view a full catalog of our past presentations and for a schedule of our upcoming webinars, please visit nonviolent-conflict.org and click on the Learning and Resources tab. Today's webinar is titled Civil Resistance and Military Dynamics, Examining Security Force Defections in the Arab Spring, and will be delivered by Sharon Erickson Nepstad. Sharon Erickson Nepstad is the Chair and Professor of Sociology at the University of New Mexico. Nepstad received her PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder and did postdoctoral studies at Princeton University. She was also a visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame University, and she's the author of numerous articles and 3 books, including Nonviolent Revolutions, Civil Resistance in the Late 20th Century, published in 2011 by Oxford University Press, Religion and War Resistance in the Plowshares Movement, published in 2008 by Cambridge University Press, and finally, Convictions of the Soul, Religion, Culture, and Agency in the Central American Solidarity Movement, published in 2004 by Oxford University Press. She is currently completing a book manuscript that surveys the growing field of nonviolent civil resistance, and this book, entitled Nonviolent Civil Resistance, Theories, Strategies, and Dynamics, is under contract with Oxford. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sharon Nepstad.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about civil resistance and military dynamics in the Arab Spring. Now, right after September 11th, 2001, the media overwhelmingly was depicting Middle Eastern countries as a breeding ground for terrorism, religious fanaticism, and violence. But a decade later, numerous Middle Eastern countries have been leading the world in nonviolent struggles for democracy. In some of these countries, like Tunisia and Egypt, citizens have successfully ousted long-standing political regimes using these methods of civil resistance. In other countries, like Bahrain, the struggle is ongoing. And in some countries, like Libya and Syria, civil resistors have seen their nonviolent campaigns overwhelmed by armed struggle, and that's led to civil war. So how do we explain all these different outcomes? One key factor that helps to explain it is whether or not the military in each of these cases remained loyal to the state or defected and sided with the movement. And this finding, of course, is consistent with other research that shows military defections really matter in nonviolent conflicts. We know, for example, from Chenoweth and Stephan's book in 2011, that civil resistance struggles are about 46 times more likely to usher in regime change when the military defects. But most nonviolent studies have actually focused on what the movements are doing, focusing on actual civil resistance campaigns, tactics, and strategic actions. And because of that, we really haven't paid that much attention to the military, and so we have relatively little knowledge of when, why, and how defections occur. So what I hope to do today are the following. I have 4 goals. First, I'd like to examine various responses that troops can take when faced with organized civil resistance and an unjust state. We'll certainly be talking about defections, but there are a variety of other responses as well. Second, I'd like to very quickly present some of the factors that contribute to defections. Third, I want to explore why security defections occurred in some of the Arab Spring uprisings, but not in others. And then finally, I'd like to reflect on the positive as well as the potentially negative consequences of military defections on civil resistance struggles. So let's start with the first goal, and that is to look at the different types of security force responses. You can really think of these on a spectrum. On the far left end of the spectrum is full loyalty to the state, and on the far right end of the spectrum is mutiny or defection. But in between, there are a whole bunch of other options that troops have when they're faced with civil resistance struggles. So if we start on the far left end of the spectrum with full loyalty, of course this is self-explanatory. This is when troops dutifully carry out their orders and maintain allegiance to the regime. But if you shift slightly to the right, you also have the possibility of shirking. And this is when troops intentionally do a poor job or they pretend to misunderstand orders and then carry them out incorrectly. It can also be covert disobedience. And what this is a chance for troops to give the appearance of being loyal and the ability to deny that their actions were intentional or politically motivated. And that makes cooperation or non-cooperation less risky. Shifting again, there's the option of selective compliance. And this is when troops simply become unreliable. They carry out some orders, but they may ignore and refuse other ones. We also have the possibility of desertions, or what we often refer to as going AWOL, absent without leave. In desertions, troops choose to leave their military post without permission and without the intention of returning. Another possibility is outright disobedience. This is when security forces refuse all orders to repress and attack civil resistors, but they do not flee as in desertions. Instead, what I'm talking about here is an intentional and a public withdrawal from the conflict. In other words, they're cutting ties to the regime and refusing to cooperate with the state, but the military is not siding with the movement. They're simply withholding their sanctioning power. On the far right end of the spectrum, of course, is mutiny or defection. And this, again, is slightly different because security forces break ties with the state and then they cast their support with the opposition. So it entails an open challenge to authorities. This is when the military that once upheld the state is now helping nonviolently to overthrow it. Most of our research has really looked at mutiny and loyalty. We really need future researchers to also explore the impact of shirking and selective compliance because we know it does make an impact. We simply have less knowledge. But I would like to review the literature that talks about mutiny and loyalty. And really the literature says basically there are three different categories of factors that can influence these outcomes. Of course, the state does a variety of things to try to keep their troops loyal. Civil resistors try to do a number of things to undermine troop loyalty. And then there are a variety of structural or macro level factors that also have an effect. So let me start by talking about what regimes do to try to maintain troop loyalty. Perhaps the most common tactic is to punish or to threaten to punish troops who are disloyal. But sometimes they also use patronage, which provides an economic incentive for maintaining the state. And patronage can be either regulated or unregulated. And basically, regulated patronage is tantamount to corporate goodies. It means increased salaries, larger budgets, new equipment, and weaponry. And this practice is really grounded in the belief that if you enrich the military, then soldiers' loyalty to you will be greater because they want to protect the very regime that's providing all these benefits. Unregulated patronage is often personal, sometimes illicit benefits that are exchanged for loyalty. Unregulated patronage can take a variety of forms. It can be giving cars to high-ranking officers, offering them private sector contracts, or even the right to extort businesses. And the same premise is at play, that troops are going to stay loyal and keep a regime in power because they want to continue to enrich themselves and have access to these benefits. Now, states sometimes also use ethnic or sectarian favoritism, and this provides troops with political incentives for maintaining the state. Now, in this approach, what a ruler does is appoint military leaders from his or her own religious, ethnic, tribal, or family group. And the premise is that security force leaders will have identity-based interests that coincide with the regime's interests. For instance, in a country in which there's an ethnically or religiously divided nation, a regime might be controlled by a dominant group, and that group then employs only military members from their own social group. Basically, this gives officers a stake in maintaining the regime because any fear would take away their group's privileges. While the state's trying to keep troops loyal, what we see are civil resistors often are trying to erode that loyalty. They're trying to encourage defections. And they have a variety of tactics to achieve this goal. First, they can try to raise the political costs of loyalty. They can remind troops that, in fact, a repressive crackdown could yield significant political costs. It could create a legitimacy crisis for the military, both on a domestic level and an international level, and that can result in costs and sanctions against the state. Of course, key to this point is that civil resistors need to ensure that the global media will capture any kind of repressive event and air it to the international community. The movement can also try to raise the moral costs of regime loyalty. We saw this, for instance, in the 1986 People Power movement in the Philippines. When President Ferdinand Marcos ordered his troops out to disperse the crowds, they went out in tanks, and as the tanks approached, a number of priests and nuns and religious lay people knelt down in front of the tanks and began to pray. Now, the Philippines, being an overwhelmingly Catholic country, meant that the troops also were overwhelmingly Catholic. And the people kneeling before the tanks began to say, "Come pray with us. Why are you going to harm us? We're unarmed. We're your fellow Christians. Please join us." So what they were doing was basically placing these troops in a moral quandary. If they stayed loyal to the state and carried out orders to repress the protesters, they would have been violating their own moral faith. Civil resistors can also raise the honor costs of regime loyalty. They can remind troops that if in fact the regime collapses, they would be going down on the wrong side of history. And last, civil resistors can try to lower the personal cost of defecting. For instance, in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a lot of civil resistors helped defectors evade prosecution by offering them civilian clothing. Sometimes they offered them money so they could go into exile. Many times they provided transportation so these defectors could go back to their families, who would then place them in hiding. So these kinds of actions lower, but don't eliminate the risks of defection, and it makes it a more viable option for those security forces who are considering defection. Last of all, I want to talk about some of the structural or macro factors affecting defections. Nonviolent conflicts don't happen in a vacuum. They're operating within these structural conditions, and we know, for example, that the design of the military might matter. If the military has had a historic mission of basically just protecting a nation's borders, they may be less inclined to get involved in the internal political machinations of the state. Or, if the military is comprised mostly of recruits, it may be more vulnerable because recruits are forced to serve and sometimes against their will. We've also seen in some cases that the constitutional principles may make a difference. If the Constitution guarantees that a military's resources and position will be protected regardless of who is in power, then troops may not feel like there's a lot to lose and may be more willing to side with the opposition. Now, number 9 here talks about the natural resources and wealth that a nation possesses. A number of political scientists have noted that if a country has a great deal of natural resources, particularly valuable ones, that can make a difference in defections as well. For instance, if a country has vast oil reserves, they can use the revenue from the oil to enrich their military, to basically engage in patronage, or they may find that other countries are reluctant to sanction them or get involved because they don't want to jeopardize their access to their oil. And finally, as I'm already mentioning, international ties and alliances also shape a nonviolent conflict. If a regime has a strong allied relationship with another country, and that ally is willing to intervene to shore up the regime, then the state may appear really durable to soldiers. And if the soldiers believe that the state is not going to collapse, then they're less likely to defect. But we also know that in international relations, things can change rapidly. Suddenly, a regime may find that its allies no longer supporting it, and that makes the regime far more fragile. Troops may have the perception that it's likely to collapse and therefore are more willing to risk defections. So I just listed 10 different factors that we know from various literatures can make a difference in troops' decisions to stay loyal or not. But which of these factors matter most? To be honest, we really need more empirical research to answer that question. But in the case of the Arab Spring uprisings, it does appear that at least 2 of these factors have quite a bit of explanatory power. And that is, first of all, whether troops received any kind of financial or political benefits from the regime. In other words, whether they received any patronage or favoritism. And secondly, whether or not troops perceived the regime to be strong and durable or vulnerable and weak. And I argue that that perception is largely shaped by troops' responses, by the responses of the international community. What I'd like to do now is really briefly illustrate how these different factors were at play in the Arab Spring cases. And I should preface this with a caveat to say I'm not a Middle East expert. I certainly can't spend a great deal of time going into the details of each of these cases just because of our time limitation. But I think the Arab Spring cases provide a really nice comparative approach. We could see a whole bunch of uprisings occurring at the same time period in the same region under similar conditions, and yet they had different outcomes. In some cases, the military sided with the opposition. In some cases, they stayed loyal to the state. In some cases, they divided. And so in order to understand why those outcomes occurred, I'm going to quickly go through 3 different cases. Egypt, where the military defected, Bahrain, where the military remained loyal to the regime, and Syria, where we see a split. So let's start with Egypt. And of course, many of us were watching the events in Egypt unfold, and we know quite a bit of the history, but very quickly, of course, the Egyptian uprising was inspired by the successful movement in neighboring Tunisia. And it was in Tunisia where a street vendor set himself on fire in December of 2010 to protest the country's economic conditions. Within days, that immolation had mobilized thousands of people to protest, and those protests eventually evolved into a national strike. Although Tunisian President Ben Ali tried to appease the population with promises of new jobs and new elections, it was simply too little, too late. And by mid-January, the military refused to shoot at protesters. Knowing that he'd lost control over any kind of sanctioning power, the president fled to Saudi Arabia. Now, thousands of people in Egypt were watching what was going on in Tunisia, and they called for their own sets of demonstrations to be held, first of all, on January 25th, 2011. And on that day, tens of thousands of Egyptians gathered in Cairo to protest the country's economic conditions, police brutality, political corruption, and repression. But they also called for the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak, who had been ruling Egypt for roughly 20 years. Now, Mubarak did what he typically did. He sent out the military. But instead of cracking down on the protesters, the military actually defended them, and in some cases they even protected the protesters from aggressive police and paramilitary groups. A few days later, the armed forces once again refused orders to shoot at civil resistors. By the beginning of February, 1.5 million people had gathered in Cairo to demand regime change. To stop the demonstrations, Mubarak made several concessions, including a promise to not seek re-election. But the civil resistors were not appeased, and they continued to protest. By February 11th, the military announced that it would side with the opposition, and Mubarak fled. Why, in this case, did the military shift its allegiance to the movement? A number of analysts have argued that it had a lot to do with the military's economic incentives. Namely, during Hosni Mubarak's time in office, he had intentionally enriched the military. In other words, he'd engaged in this kind of patronage. He had allowed the military to acquire valuable real estate and numerous different industries. And again, the idea was, as long as he was in office, the military would prosper, and that would keep them loyal. However, Hosni Mubarak was planning to retire and hand over the presidential office to his son, Gamal Mubarak. And Gamal Mubarak had very different ideas about how he wanted to run the economy. He planned to implement a number of privatization policies that would dismantle the military's business holdings. So there was a strong economic incentive for the military to side with civil resistors, because if they could force Hosni Mubarak out, then they could derail the future plans for Gamal Mubarak to take office. I'd also like to mention here, though, that what's important is the military as an institution shifted its support. This isn't a case in which we see individuals' defections culminating in wide-scale desertions. Instead, the entire institution sided with the opposition, and what that meant is virtually no one in the military was left to impose sanctions on anyone who was deemed disloyal. Now, it is true that there were still secret police who remained loyal to Mubarak, and they could have carried out the protests, carried out the arrests. But how does a police force arrest and incarcerate the entire personnel of the armed forces? So because of this factor, many soldiers likely felt that there was not going to be punishments for their defections. Now, of course, I also want to mention the role of international relations, and particularly relevant was Egypt's relationship to the United States. The Obama administration had initially supported Hosni Mubarak, but then shifted its stance, calling for the Egyptian president to resign. The military observed this, and what they understood is that if they defied Obama and remained loyal to Mubarak, they would have potentially jeopardized $1.3 billion in aid that they received from the United States on an annual basis. So there were political costs and economic costs involved with remaining loyal to the state as well. Let me quickly go on then to Bahrain. And this is the case where we see the military remaining loyal to the state. A little bit of background. Bahrain was a former British protectorate, and in 1971 it came under the rule of the royal Khalifa family. And in 1973, the Khalifa family implemented a constitutional monarchy that protected the royal family's political supremacy, but it established a national assembly. Now, one of the tensions that immediately erupted was the fact that the Khalifa family which dominates the political and military posts of the country, are Sunni Muslims. But in contrast, about 70% of the Bahrain population is Shiite Muslim. So you can see here the demographics play out in this case. So Bahrain's Shiite Muslims felt that they did not have equal access to housing, to educational opportunities. They suffered higher unemployment rates than their Sunni counterparts. And as the National Assembly was created, they were not proportionately represented in the political institutions. So throughout the 70s and 80s, these tensions have periodically led to protests. But as Bahrain citizens watched what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt, they decided that the time was right for them to launch a new round of demonstrations. So in February 2011, they began holding protests in which they called for an end to torture, the release of political prisoners, and genuinely free elections. They also had another demand. They wanted an end to a practice called political naturalization. Now, as I mentioned, the royal Khalifa family is Sunni, and they engaged in sectarian favoritism, and they had appointed their key military leaders from their own background. They're mostly Sunnis. But what they also did is they realized that it wasn't enough to just have loyal military officers. The rank and file also needed to remain loyal. So they began recruiting Sunni Arabs from other countries such as Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, and Jordan. And they recruited them to join Bahrain's armed forces. In exchange, they were granted financial rewards and citizenship in Bahrain. So what they were doing is not only stacking the rank and file of the military with Sunnis, but also the military officers. All of this meant then that demonstrations erupted in February of 2011. And Bahrain's king, who's pictured here, ordered his troops to go out and to repress the demonstrators. The security forces did. They carried out their orders, and they killed a number of people in the process. But as so often the case in nonviolent conflicts, what we see happening here is backfire. Instead of thwarting the movement, that state-imposed violence actually strengthened it. So a growing number of citizens began to join the struggle, and this includes lawyers, teachers, engineers, and Shiite religious leaders. In fact, by one estimate, about 25% of the entire adult population was involved in the demonstrations. As these demonstrations grew, we see also the movement shifting from a reformist movement to a revolutionary one. The civil resistors began to demand an end to the Khalifa regime. The military, however, stayed loyal. And to understand why they stayed loyal, we really have to go back to this sectarian privilege. But Bahrain's sectarian tensions gave the Sunni-dominated military a stake in maintaining the regime. If the Khalifa regime was ousted, then the majority Shiites would likely reestablish a new government in which that privilege would be lost. So troops who were mostly Sunni feared that regime change would mean personal as well as group costs. Plus, those people who had been politically naturalized might have feared that they would lose their citizenship as well. So they had a lot to gain by keeping the regime in place. I also want to mention the international response to Bahrain. As soon as the demonstrations began to expand, what the Bahrain regime did is it invited in foreign support. So the United Arab Emirates sent about 500 police, Saudi Arabia sent about 1,000 troops, and the United States was reluctant to take a hard stand. They didn't impose strong sanctions, largely because they have a very important military base. The U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet is hosted by Bahrain, and they didn't want to jeopardize this key strategic post in the Middle East. So because of this, the international community response has been muted, and this likely led troops to the conclusion that the state appeared very strong. It appeared durable. It did not appear that the civil resistance struggle was going to win, and therefore defections became quite costly. Let me move on to the third case, Syria. And Syria is much like Libya in the sense that we see the military dividing. Quickly, Syria, like many other Middle Eastern countries, was suffering from high unemployment rates, declining standards of living, human rights abuses, and Syrians had been living under about 50 years of emergency rule. Now, the Syrian state had been able to keep a lid on protests over time, largely through emergency measures and through repression. But at the end of January in 2011, a Syrian citizen set himself on fire, imitating that immolation that had sparked Tunisia's uprising. And in response, we saw small demonstrations taking place. But in the beginning, they were largely out in the provinces, and they were quite small and easily crushed by the military. But again, backfire occurs, and we see the movement growing. By March of 2011, tens of thousands of people are demonstrating in cities throughout Syria. But with that expanded resistance came expanded repression. So the military sent out tanks and snipers to clear the streets, and they killed civil resistors in the process. Now, a number of Sunni recruits in the military were highly disturbed by these orders to attack unarmed civilians. And so as early as the summer of 2011, we see defections occurring. And as the military repression grew even more vicious, killing thousands of protesters, the rate of defections increased. So by the spring of 2012, about 60,000 soldiers had defected. That's about 1/5, about 20% of the entire Syrian military. What happened to these defectors? Some fled and sought asylum abroad. Some were publicly executed by the Syrian state. But some of them defected, and they took their weapons and regrouped, forming the Free Syrian Army that launched an armed struggle to try to overthrow the Syrian state. Now what we see happening is these defectors taking up weapons, but the military's officers largely stayed loyal. So it's the rank and file that defect. The officers stay loyal to the state. And again, the role of sectarian identities helps to explain what's going on in the case of Syria. As in Bahrain, we see that sectarian identities are a key part here. Approximately 11% of Syrians are Alawite, which is a small offshoot of Shia Islam. But about 74 or 75% of the population is Sunni. Although they're a minority, the Alawites have held most of the political positions, and they disproportionately fill the ranks of high-ranking military commanders and security chiefs. In fact, by one estimate, it's over 90% of Syria's military officers are from an Alawite background. Now, the reason for this is clear. The Assad family had intentionally filled high-ranking political and military positions with their trusted family members and people from their own religious sect as part of a coup-proofing plan. This is part of that sectarian favoritism I talked about earlier. So Alawite officers who control the military are unlikely to oppose the state because their fate is tied to the regime's fate. If the state is deposed and overturned, then Alawite dominance and privilege is lost. In contrast, though, the rank and file are largely Sunni conscripts, and these conscripts are much more likely to identify with the civil resistors, who are also mostly Sunnis. So when they were given orders to repress demonstrators, they faced a moral quandary. There was a high moral cost. Loyalty to the regime would require them to repress their own people, and this was a price that many of them were unwilling to pay. Finally, I also again want to mention the role of the international community, because Assad and his loyal troops continue to crack down on resistors with little regard for any political costs. And this may be due to the fact that the international community has been divided over Syria. The response is fraught with various competing interests, and the sanctions have been minimal. And again, what that means is for individual soldiers, it gives the appearance that the state is not fragile, the state is not on the verge of collapsing, and therefore the costs of defecting are rather high. Now that I've gone through these three cases, I want to just summarize some of the conclusions we can draw, at least from the Arab Spring cases that we just reviewed. One conclusion is that security forces are likely to side with nonviolent resistors if it enables them to protect their financial and political interests. This is what happened in Egypt. A second conclusion, in highly stratified societies where one group dominates, individual soldiers are less likely to remain loyal, are likely to remain loyal if they're members of the dominant group. But if they're members of a subordinate group, they're less likely to be loyal. A third conclusion, when soldiers from a subordinate ethnic or sectarian group are ordered to repress their own people, they face a high moral cost for loyalty, and these moral costs may override any fears they have of punishment for defecting. Fourth, the international community is less likely to impose sanctions on a nation that holds great strategic or economic importance. If no sanctions or no statement is imposed, then if foreign troops arrive to reinforce the regime, troops are unlikely to defect because they perceive the state as highly durable. In recent studies that have looked at defections, the emphasis has been on how defections help civil resistors win. But these cases also raise some other points, namely that there are challenges and risks with military defections. And one of the main risks we see in this case is the possibility that a nonviolent conflict will be transformed into a violent one. In other words, there's a considerable chance that defectors will take their weapons, regroup, and launch an armed struggle against the state. And this can shift a situation from civil resistance to civil war. And that's what we saw happen in Syria as well as Libya. Once civil war breaks out, it can be very difficult for nonviolent resistance leaders to regain control of the struggle. A second challenge is that the military may actually usurp the movement's power and credibility. When the military sides with the opposition, officers may use that opportunity to impose their own agenda, which may not be consistent with civil resistors' goals. If we think about the recent resistance in Egypt, one can think about the fact that after Hosni Mubarak was deposed, the military temporarily took control and then implemented multi-party elections. Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood was elected as president, but very quickly people became disenchanted with him because he expanded his presidential authority. He granted himself unlimited powers without judicial oversight. So a new civil resistance struggle emerged, and again millions of Egyptians joined in. And after about a year in office, Morsi was forced out with the assistance of the military in July of 2013. But was the second campaign really a success for civil resistors? This is a question, of course, that people are still discussing, and several analysts have noted that the military and the movement may have worked too closely together. Some have even suggested that perhaps the movement may have been, that the military may have used the movement for its purposes. I have a quotation here from a recent article by Erica Chenoweth in which she says, "During Egypt's recent turmoil, one could argue that there was too much collusion between nonviolent people power and security forces. After several days of demonstrations and protests, the Egyptian military declared that it had no choice but to remove Morsi from power. Yet there are indications that organizers and military elites had coordinated their plan for months. As early as February of 2013, some senior Egyptian officers were in private talks with liberal opposition groups, asking them whether they would approve of the military ousting Morsi. Such accounts indicate that this was less of a process of protest-induced defections than of a popularly backed coup." So what can civil resistors do to avoid some of these problems? Well, first of all, Chenoweth actually argues that maybe civil resistors should encourage outright disobedience instead of defections or mutiny. Outright disobedience, just to recall, is when the military withholds its sanctioning power. It refuses order, but it doesn't side with the movement. And what happens in this case is basically, by withdrawing from the nonviolent conflict, it allows the civil resistors to maintain their struggle, but it's undercutting the sanctioning power from the state. It's removing one of the state's key pillars of support, which will then increase the leverage of the resistance movement. This is basically what happened in Tunisia. Another thing is that civil resistors need to be wary of too much collusion with the armed forces. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be conversations, that there shouldn't be talk, but they should just be mindful of the potential problems that exist. One thing is clear, however, that we need more research on this topic because security force defections can't be ignored. Civil resistor security force relationships matter in nonviolent conflicts, and they have a very clear impact on the outcomes. Therefore, for better or worse, we need to be paying attention to the role of the military and its relationship with civil resistors. So with that, I'd like to conclude my talk and then open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Sharon, thank you so much for your presentation. And so now I'll open it up to everybody here who's still listening. So I have a question already from Paul, sort of a question comment, who asks, regarding the factor about ethnic and sectarian favoritism in the military, there seems to be two separate mechanisms at work. Number one, what the troops think will happen to their group as a whole as a result of the conflict, and two, their own feelings about the people whom they are assigned to repress, as in my people versus otherwise. And Paul was wondering if you could speak more to the difference between these two mechanisms.
I think Paul, you're absolutely right. There are two separate mechanisms going on. And of course, it's really difficult for troops as the conflict unfolds to be processing all this information. It's much easier for us as social scientists to look back at the situation and identify a variety of factors that played a role in the decision to defect. Troops are trying to process this in real time as things are unfolding. And certainly their feelings about the population matter, and they're trying to make sure that if they defect, the costs of doing so are not going to be as great. So I think one of the things that civil resistors could do is to increase that empathy between the troops and the civil resistors. In my presentation, I made it sound like it's merely a reflection of whether or not they share some ethnic or sectarian identity. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that civil resistors can develop those relationships and develop empathy and connections simply based on humans and people who are in the same country who want a strong future for their nation. So they are separate mechanisms at play, and of course in the mind of troops there are a variety of things that they're taking into consideration. The risks, the costs, the likelihood of getting caught, the imposition of their own moral kind of concerns about imposing sanctions on a population. But I think that's a very important point for civil resistors to think about as well, that they need to humanize the face of the movement to those troops, because that certainly will increase their emotional responses to orders to repress unarmed civilians. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few people who have their hands raised. First off, we have Theodore. Theodore, please go ahead with your question.
Hi there. Thanks very much for your very interesting talk. I wanted to ask quickly about the distinction between military leadership and troops in their decisions to make. For example, do you think that, for instance, economic patronage is as important to the rank and file as it would be to the leadership of the military in a state like Egypt? And second of all, about the possibility, I mean, given the events in Egypt in the last couple of years and the behavior of the military since the uprising, one wonders whether the possibility of capturing the state, or eventually taking charge, was in the back of the minds of military leaders all along, and whether that would be a calculation that would differentiate them in an important way from the troops. Because a lot of your analysis, and I do the same thing in stuff I've written, lumps in the military leadership and the rank and file together. But I wonder if there's sort of room to push on that distinction, and maybe you think that's interesting.
Yes, thank you for those comments. And of course, in 30 minutes, I'm not able to cover everything, but I certainly think that there are different mechanisms at play for military leaders and the troops. And in fact, I'm actually excited. I think there's a lot of research that can be done here in nonviolent studies. Of course, people in security studies and military studies have been looking at this for a while, but historically, that field of study and civil resistance or nonviolent studies haven't been reading each other's work very much. I think that's changing right now, and so those of us who study nonviolent movements are learning a great deal from military studies and from security studies, and I do think that we see defections happening in different ways. And if you look at some cases like the Philippines, or if you look at like East Germany, there are different dynamics. In certain cases we see the troops defecting first. Certain cases we see military leadership defecting. And so it's hard to have one theory that fits all cases, because it could be a top-down sort of defection, it could be a bottom-up type of defection, but clearly military leadership and the rank and file are going to have different interests. And I'm not a military expert, but I would imagine that if the patronage is only given to the officers and not to the troops, that incentive isn't going to work for them. And of course, generals can only issue orders that their orders are only going to be carried out if the troops are in compliance. So I think it's a lot more complicated. And in fact, there's a lot other ways that I think we need to complexify our studies. I've talked exclusively about the military, but even if you look at Egypt, so you have the security police and the police force remaining loyal. So what happens when the military defects but the police do not? Or what happens when one branch of the military defects and other branches stay loyal. I think there's a lot more possibilities of how these things unfold than I've certainly depicted in today's presentation. And it would be fascinating to do a comparison of the factors that lead troops, rank and file recruits, to defect versus the officers. I would imagine patronage that often goes to the officers is important. I don't know if it matters as much for the recruits. I'm guessing, based on these cases, that the recruits may have a different set of incentives or a different set of concerns. Your question about the recent events in Egypt and what might have been in the minds of military leaders, I would love if somebody could go over to Egypt and get access to these military leaders and do interviews and find out. And of course, I'm not sure that they would actually be open and forthcoming about the real incentives that they had in collaborating with the movement. But I do think this is something that we need to be a little bit careful about. And I think civil resistors are so focused on kind of removing those pillars of support from the state, because that's what, of course, gives them greater leverage, and that's what undermines the power of the state. But they have to think carefully about whether they're being used for military purposes, or even if they're not being used for military purposes, if they're going to lose control of the movement by having military leaders come in. And so these are, in my opinion, areas that are ripe for future research, and I hope we see just an abundance of studies coming out on these topics. And thank you for pointing my attention towards those types of issues. Thanks.
Okay, we'll try going to the next person. Mufida.
Thank you. I am from Tunisia, so from the Arab Spring. I need your idea about the Arab Spring in Tunisia and the revolution in Tunisia. Say that Bahrain, the military remains loyal. I think Tunisia also. But I have a question about the cost of civil resistance and military. What is the cost for this country of Arab Spring? Thank you.
Can you clarify what you mean by the cost? What kind of cost? Are you talking about economic costs? Are you talking about political costs? I'm not sure I understand the question you have.
I don't understand you.
You were asking about the costs of?
Yes, the cost of using the civil resistance, because there is a cost. Economic, political, and social cost.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, there's been a number of studies that show nonviolent conflicts have fewer costs in terms of impact on the economy, devastation of the infrastructure and the environment than an armed conflict would. So there have been some studies coming out, including Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's work, where they indicate there's always a cost. There's always a cost. And even though we call these nonviolent conflicts, that doesn't mean that people are not physically harmed in these processes. But the evidence that they put forward in their book surely seems compelling that nonviolent means of waging a conflict are going to result in fewer economic costs, fewer costs in terms of devastation to the infrastructure, so that when the conflict is over, it's easier for that nation to get back on its feet. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's not an easy task. But if you've had an armed conflict in which the basic communication systems and transportation systems have been devastated, if there's a lot of rebuilding and reparation that has to be made, the tasks that are set forward in rebuilding the country are much greater than in a nonviolent conflict. So I think any time there's a conflict and a struggle involved, there are costs, whether they're human costs, economic costs, infrastructural costs. But the evidence does seem to appear that the loss of human life, the loss of economic resources is less in a nonviolent conflict than in an armed struggle. I don't have the exact statistics. If we looked at, for example, Libya and Syria versus Tunisia and Egypt, I don't have that information right off the top of my head, but I think we can see that even though there are some unique circumstances to each country, that overall nonviolent conflicts are less costly, both in human and physical consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. We'll do another few raised hands and then switch back to the written questions. The next person is Ryan C.
Ryan, are you there? Hey, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for the presentation. It was really informative and really interesting, especially with the real-life examples. I've seen a lot of similar stuff with Outpour's work and the George Lakey kind of framework of the pillars of support. And this seems to focus a lot on the police and military. And in addition to that, there's also the bureaucracy, education, religion, media, business, etc.
Right.
I was wondering, we have a lot of tools in America. If we were to replicate some of these tools here in this country, would there be a way to use some of the public opinion research tools to kind of figure out what would actually motivate the police and military to move towards our direction, or what would motivate people that are in the bureaucracy or in religious apparatuses? And I'm thinking of, like, you know, using focus groups and polling and things like that to actually figure out what would move them in different places throughout the world. Thanks for answering my question.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, so much of our research on these kinds of conflicts takes place in authoritarian settings and takes place in a conflict situation in which it's really a question whether the state is going to survive. Of course, it looks quite different in a democracy like the United States, and that's not to say that we don't also have issues with police brutality. I think there's plenty of evidence to indicate that. The question really becomes, how well do some of these models translate from authoritarian contexts into democratic ones? And I think there are important differences that we need to be mindful of, but the basic model that Gene Sharp put forward, that's been adopted by groups like Outpour, is in fact that you identify some of these important pillars of support for the state, which include, as you mentioned, religious leaders and institutions and the police and the media. And I think it's a less of a dramatic confrontation that you might see, for instance, as in Egypt, but nonetheless, civil resistors can do a lot, I think, to be winning over religious institutions, to be winning over the police force, or at least to make sure that the police are empathetic with the movement. I think that benefits any kind of movement that has these types of goals at stake. I think it would be terrific. I know there are some social movement groups that do meet with the police officers, whether there's been systematic research like focus groups that talk about the factors that might win their sympathy. I'm not aware of any that have that particular focus to it. So again, I think what's happening is the field of nonviolent studies is just burgeoning right now, and we're seeing so many areas that are in need of future research, and my hope is that we can begin to bridge more of these literatures, for instance, like the repression literature and social movements. I think if people put forward that kind of data and have these focus groups, we can start to see more of what's going on in the minds of police officers, which is one of the limitations of the studies that we have so far, is that we're looking at these factors, but there's very few studies in which people actually sit down with police officers or sit down with troops that defect and interview them, find out what is actually going through your mind when you're making these kinds of decisions. What is going through your mind when you're given an order to attack a protester? What kinds of things might stop you from carrying out that order? Lots of room for research, because I think those models are applicable even if they need to be modified a bit as we move them from kind of an authoritarian setting into a democratic one. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Our next question comes from Howard B.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. And I'd like to, I probably would end up making a proposition which I'd like you to comment on. Both you and some of the questioners have raised doubts about the motivation of the Egyptian army, or certainly the upper echelons of it, in supporting the revolution, the popular revolution in Egypt, the first popular revolution in 2011. And we don't know, as you pointed out, what in fact motivated them, and I think our reserve on that is appropriate. But I want to put forward a plausible point of view, which we've heard, I'm sure, all of us from various people, and it is that the Egyptian, what motivated the senior echelons of the Egyptian military was in fact their exploitation of, or the opportunity they saw in the revolution to actually solidify their preeminence and to some degree one could almost speak of control of the large sectors of the Egyptian economy and certainly of the state. Mm-hmm. And that this became manifest in the second revolution recently, in which the Morsi government was overthrown. Now, if that is indeed the case, it seems to raise a problem for civil resistance thinking, And I want to go back, if I may, very briefly, let us go back to the Paris Commune and what Marx and Engels had to say about the Paris Commune, which was that one of the reasons for the defeat of the Paris Commune was that they failed to destroy, and I use the term destroy, they failed to destroy their opponent's military power at a crucial moment. Now, we know that the civil resistance is not in the business of destroying things, certainly in any physical or military sense. Mm-hmm. What civil resistance is talking about is removing these pillars of support of a regime and, in that sense, dislocating power and bringing about its collapse. The proposition I'm putting, and I suppose I can put it also as a question, is do you think the time has come for civil resistance scholarship to start looking at not just removing the pillars of support, but perhaps substantially dismantling the pillars of previous regime support in order to ensure a democratic future beyond the revolutionary moment?
That's a fabulous proposition. I'm very pleased that you raised that issue. And I think, in fact, one of the shortcomings of our current research is that it's really looked, and I indict myself on this as well, it currently looks at getting the old regime out. And there's been less attention to rebuilding a new one that would ensure that those kind of previous pillars are sufficiently transformed that they're not going to cause a new problem or be the foundation for a new type of regime that simply has a new leader to it. I think what this might also be reflecting is one of the ongoing conversations that is happening among those of us who study and talk and research nonviolence, and one of the tensions between those who are advocating a strategic approach to nonviolence and those who are talking about a more principled approach. And in fact, I don't really like that debate because I think it simplifies it into a dichotomy that's not an actual reflection of strategic and principled nonviolence. But I think it does harken back to what Gandhi talked about, that it's not just enough to get the British out, that we have to rebuild our economy, that we have to rebuild our culture, that we have to transform these institutions that propped up the old regime, but that could prop up a new set of elites that might have a different agenda, but can still control a population in an oppressive manner. So I think there's a healthy dialogue and tension that takes place in those conversations about the limits of strategic violence, the practicality about principled nonviolence, and my hope would be that in that conversation we come to these kinds of points, that is it just enough to remove the old dictator and leave the military intact? Or do we need to rethink what defense means? And so maybe we have to transform a military to really go back to the notion of defense, of protecting one's borders, of protecting life, rather than upholding a particular political group. So I think that would be fantastic, and I would love to see future research studies look at transformation as a longer-term process, not just the changing of political leaders, but whether it leads to these kind of wide-scale structural institutional transformations. And I think the second revolutionary movement in Egypt is pointing out the limitations of having a too narrow focus on just ousting the leadership. I think that's exactly what's happening, is that there's not sufficient transformation of the society, at least at this point, to make it a really stabilized democracy in which civil resistors don't worry about the intentions of the military. So excellent point, and I hope lots of people take that to heart as they continue to research these topics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This next one will go with Paulina B.
Good evening. I'm talking from Tel Aviv, and thank you for this lecture. I wanted to ask regarding the point that, if I understood clear, the behavior of the military is a crucial factor that actually affects the success of the civil resistance. But are there some tools that will help to manage, to limit, to control the influence of military people to the resistance movement after they will take the movement side, actually?
Yes, and I think this is where, going back to that spectrum of responses, we've always focused on defection. How do we get the military to not only withdraw its support from the state, but then side with the civil resistors? I think this call to maybe encourage outright disobedience instead of defection is an important point, because as soon as the military sides with the opposition, it is in coalition with the opposition. And as I tried to point out, there are a number of dangers to that. How you encourage a military to basically withdraw its sanctioning power without siding, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what civil resistors would need to do. But I think the case in Tunisia is one that really merits further exploration, because in that case, it's different from Egypt in the sense that the military just said, look, we're not going to get involved in this. We're not going to overthrow the state, but we're not going to crack down on protesters. This is a conflict that civil resistors need to solve in terms of their challenges to the state. And basically, they physically withdrew from the conflict. In Tunisia, they had that historic mission of mostly being a military that defends borders. It had not been involved in a particular political party. It did not see itself as having the role of protecting the state. It was a military that saw its role as protecting the people and protecting it from foreign invasions. And so what they physically actually did is they withdrew to the borders, and they didn't have a presence in the capital city when these protests were happening. And I think that's very important, not only symbolically and practically, but what it does is it really isolates the conflict between a few set of political elites who are clinging to power and the civil resistance movement. And it takes the military out of the picture. So neither side is backed by the military. And it means then the state cannot crack down because there's nobody to carry out those orders to repress. But it also means that the civil resistors are given the leadership in the struggle, that they can continue to fight for whatever their goal is without worrying about the other incentives or motivations of the military in joining them. It's basically pulling that pillar of support out from the state and removing it from the struggle. How realistic that is, it's difficult to assess, and I think part of what happened to Tunisia is a reflection of the structural design of their military. And that is, I think, something that civil resistors should pursue. How do we win the sympathy of the military and encourage them to not carry out sanctions and orders to repress, but not encourage them to get involved in a leading role in overthrowing the state? Because really, for it to be a nonviolent conflict, it needs to be rooted in the civilian struggle. And that's problematic when the military joins in. So I don't have a simple answer. I think the Tunisian one is the case that we can look to see a little bit more of what that kind of scenario looks like. But I think we need more research to understand how civil resistors can try to facilitate that scenario rather than the kind we see in Egypt. Thank you, Paulina.
Okay, we'll go with two last questions. This next one is from Elizabeth.
I'm muted.
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just told me I was muted.
Okay.
I love your presentation, and I'm very interested in just asking you to expand on your comments that you made in response to a previous question about the need to dismantle the states, and you actually mentioned Gandhi, about whom I'm writing very intensively right now, and the distinction between principled and strategic embrace of nonviolence. I'm just interested in hearing more of your thoughts about that distinction, because I'm kind of honing in on it and putting together my own thoughts right now, but it kind of, it's been sort of nagging over everything I've been writing right now, and I'm just interested in hearing more about what you think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is an important debate, and I think really we need to take the best of both approaches. So some of the people who are advocating for strategic nonviolence say, look, you're never going to get the entire population to really think of nonviolence as a way of life, as principled pacifism. What we need is for people to sign on to a struggle in which they voluntarily agree to not use violence. And maybe in that struggle, they are convinced of the efficacy and the power of nonviolence and start to explore more of the principled ideas behind it. And I actually tend to agree with that position, that, you know, in a moment like Egypt, when people are in a kind of a showdown with the state, what you need to do is get people on board, because we know from studies like Erica Chenoweth's that mass participation really does matter. And you don't have the time to talk about Gandhi or to talk about King or to talk about all the principles behind nonviolence as a personal philosophical commitment. But I also think that too much of strategic nonviolence has sold itself short on political gains, that what we're doing is to achieve this goal. Clearly, it's hard to transform structures and to change society until you get a dictator or an autocrat out of office. I mean, that is a first and essential preliminary step. But too often then the movements end there. And so I think those people who are teaching and practicing strategic nonviolence would really benefit from reading some of Gandhi's other ideas. And of course, you know, even Gene Sharp's model is built off of Gandhi's strategy. I don't like the presentation that Gandhi was principled and had these ideas and the strategic people have the methods. In fact, Gandhi was a brilliant strategist. So in fact, I think he embodies the principled and the strategic in kind of a unified way that few others do. But I think we've lost some of his points about once we have political independence, we're still enslaved if we don't have economic independence. We're still enslaved if we keep in cultural systems of domination like the caste system. So he kept saying, we have to work on these things simultaneously. His emphasis on the constructive program, that rebuilding society is just as important as ousting the old political institution. And it's far easier in that transition if those processes are happening simultaneously, as Gandhi was advocating, right? Let's stop buying British goods and start building our local economies through our own capacity for production. And so that when we gain independence, we've already got kind of a grassroots economic infrastructure in place to make that transition smoother. I think that artificial divide between strategic and principled nonviolence has meant that some people have overlooked those points that in fact are strategic. If you want, as a long-term goal, democracy, then you need to put in place more than just a political institution. You have to also put in place economic institutions that are facilitative of a democratic society. If you want to have genuine human rights, you have to change cultural attitudes that may be preventing that. So I would love to see more of the strategic approach incorporate Gandhi's idea of a constructive program. And of course, there's more to Gandhi than that as well, in his whole notion of satyagraha and seeing the good in your opponent. There's a lot to be learned there. I do recognize realistically in the heat of a moment when there is a conflict like this happening, it's hard to get all of that message out, but I think there is more that could be done. And if we can blend, kind of bring a synthesis of both the principled ideas, the constructive program, as well as kind of the strategy of how you oust the old system, we're going to see even more effective outcomes in terms of transitions to democratic systems and transitions to more humane social institutions. Those are my thoughts on it, but you may well have many if you've been working on and writing about this in your own work. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you so much. It looks like we've gone a little bit over. That's okay because we started a few minutes late. But I was wondering if you had any closing remarks or anything else you wanted to mention before we wrapped up.
I don't, other than to say this is a very exciting time for nonviolent civil resistance studies. We're seeing interest in this across multiple disciplines. It's a time when we're starting to take into account factors like the military that we hadn't paid a lot of attention to before. And so I'm very pleased to see all the interest in it, and I'm hoping that there's a whole generation of young scholars and researchers out there who are going to add to our knowledge of these topics, including the role of the military. Thanks.